I used to share a study table with Emily Granger every night before finals. She'd always joke that she lived in the library. Then one evening she really did because she never came out. I don't measure my life in years anymore. I measure it in exam weeks and late nights, in the soft click of a library clock, in the long breath I held waiting for Emily to walk back to our dorm room. 13 finals weeks have passed since she didn't. I still hear the same hum of fluorescent lights and see the same rain streaking down those old basement windows. Thin, nervous lines, as if the building itself were holding back tears. Back then I was 20, impatient, and always apologizing to everyone for things I didn't do. I worried about money, about whether my dad's job at the hardware store would last, about whether I'd ever be brave enough to say no to anything. Emily was my counterweight. She was not loud, not bold, but steady. She knitted during lectures and donated the scarves to the campus shelter. She kept a small jar of folded gum wrappers on her shelf, silver stars, because some teacher long ago told her that if she made 1,000, a wish would come true. I didn't believe in wishes at that age. I believed in flashcards and caffeine. We met as assigned roommates. On the door to our room, Emily hung a paper sign that said "Welcome Home" in neat black ink. She wrote all her letters that way, like she was drafting them for a museum display. At night, when our hall was too loud to sleep, we took our books to the library. We always chose the same table, the one tucked behind the English literature shelves on the basement level, near the old wooden study carrels with carved initials from decades of undergrads. I can still feel the grooves of names under my palms like tiny ghosts. Sometimes we'd trade glances over the spines of our books. Emily would raise an eyebrow and mouth, "Tea?" And I'd nod. We were boring, in the best way. The last week of the fall term in 2011, a storm crawled over the town. The basement smelled like damp carpet and wet jackets. Pipes ticked. The librarians brought out industrial fans, but all they did was move the cool, musty air around. Finals had everyone brittle. Even the people who usually joked were quiet. On that Thursday night, Emily said, "Go to bed, Laura. I'm on a roll." It was a familiar script. She pulled her hair up and tucked a pencil behind her ear. She had a new habit, though, glancing toward the back wall past the fiction stacks. When I asked what she kept looking at, she shrugged. "There's a draft," she said. "Feels like a vent is open somewhere." I offered to wait for her, but she smiled. "I'll be up soon." She didn't come. The next morning, her bed looked slept in only by a ghost. Blanket folded at the corner, pillow with the faint dip of her head, cardigan thrown over the chair. Her wallet was on the dresser. Her student ID hung from a lanyard on the doorknob. I thought she'd just curled up somewhere and fallen asleep, but even then my chest knew something else. What followed was what always follows. The forms, the statements, the exhausted emails. The campus police asked whether Emily had problems, whether she drank, whether she had gotten mixed up with anyone. I said no to everything, then cried in the stairwell. My mother drove in from out of town and sat with me, holding my hand in the very serious way mothers do when they know you're standing on the edge of something you won't be able to back away from. Weeks turned to months. People assumed she'd run away or gone home or taken off with a boyfriend. She didn't have one. She had a routine and she had me. I wrote her name on a post-it and stuck it to my mirror because I was afraid of how fast the world takes names away. I promised I'd keep looking, even after graduation, even after the new students stopped recognizing her face on the flyers. 13 years passed. I got a job at a small-town library. I learned the codes to the alarm panel and the sound the elevator makes when it's tired. I learned that grief doesn't leave. It shifts its weight from one shoulder to the other. Then last spring, the phone rang with a number from campus. A late spring storm had flooded the old library, and a maintenance crew had found something behind a warped bookshelf in the basement. A narrow door, a secret little room, and inside a backpack with Emily's name stitched into the lining. I bought a bus ticket the same afternoon. The campus had shrunk the way places do when you return older than your memories. Even the oaks felt shorter. The library's basement entrance was blocked by plastic sheets and caution tape that moved in the breeze like slow jellyfish. A maintenance supervisor met me at the door. He introduced himself as Calvin Reed, a name I immediately stored, the way you put a thumb on a line in a book so you can find it again. "We were tearing out waterlogged shelves," he said, walking me down the concrete stairwell. "The wall back there didn't look right. When we touched it, it sounded wrong, hollow. He wore the apologetic expression of men who fix things for a living when they can't. They'd already wedged the shelf aside. A thin metal door sat behind it, the paint blistered by years of damp. The room beyond was barely bigger than a shower. It had no window. Shelves lined its sides, empty in some places and piled in others with ruined boxes of forms, broken plastic crates, a cracked thermos with a faded sticker of a polar bear. Emily's sticker. My breath went tight. You never expect the physical world to still be wearing someone's fingerprints. On the floor lay a plastic bag with a notebook in it, a Ziploc, thick and cloudy. And next to it, her student lanyard, the metal clip corroded to green. The smell was old paper and mildew and something else I don't have a name for. Not death. The police would have the words for that later. Just time sealed and stale. Calvin crouched and handed me the notebook. They told me you were her roommate, he said. I thought you should be the one. Inside, beneath the thin film of moisture, were pages written in Emily's exacting hand. She had dated each entry like she always did for her class notes. The first one was December 10th, 2011. Laura fell asleep early. The library was almost empty tonight. I checked the corner behind the stacks again. The vent cover is loose. I can feel air. I think there's a tunnel. You can hear voices if you press your ear to the wall. 2 men. They said not down here, and something about boxes. I won't write names yet. I'm not sure what I'm hearing. My brain jumped like it had touched an electric fence. I had sat 20 feet from that very wall all those nights and never pressed my ear to anything but a hardcover. I flipped. The next entry. If anything happens, the letters are in the bottom compartment. I looked around the room. Bottom compartment meant something to Emily. She loved compartments. She had a jewelry box with hidden layers and showed anyone who asked how to open the lid with the little notch in the back. But here, after the flood, the floor was a gray mush of ruined paper. I didn't see any compartments, only the suggestion of one. A section of shelf base with a warped seam. I pushed. It wouldn't move. I would later learn the water had swollen it shut. For now, I slid the notebook back into its bag, as if returning it would return time with it. I stayed at a downtown motel with a peach-colored comforter and curtains that smelled like lemon cleaner. I read the notebook over and over. She wrote about a study partner who had told her where the maintenance maps were stored, about boxes without receipts, about badge names that didn't match the directory. The entries were short, spare. Emily, even then, wrote like she was giving a deposition for a future no one else would survive to hear. I kept hearing a line from freshman year, the first week we moved in, when she said, "People will underestimate us." I'd laughed because it sounded like an after-school special, but she wasn't joking. She had a particular kind of bravery, the kind that turns the handle of a door no one else noticed. The next morning I asked for the archives, the campus archivist on duty, Doris Miller, her name pinned on a brass tag, was the kind of woman who knows where everything is and why you shouldn't touch it with your bare hands. When I explained who I was, she softened and led me to a back table. "We used to have connecting hallways down there," she said, lowering a heavy binder of blueprints bound in cloth and secured with 2 big screws. "They closed them in pieces. Money, mostly." She smiled without humor. "There might be older maps in here than in any file the university could find if you asked them." She was right. After an hour of squinting at a hand-drawn plans and red stamps, I found the basement layout for 1978. It showed exactly what Emily had suggested, a narrow corridor running behind the long wall of fiction shelves leading to a small cluster of storage closets and a service passage that dead-ended at the foundation. The margin was penciled with little notes like, "Vent okay," and "Door sticks." "You see?" Doris tapped the page with a varnished nail. "The bones of a building hardly ever go away. They just get dressed up." "I need to see it," I said. Doris didn't argue. She printed me a copy of the page, signed me a temporary visitor pass, and walked me down. Navigating the basement felt like walking through my old chest, every turn remembered. I found the study table with its shallow scratch where Emily once cut me an apple with a dull cafeteria knife. The smell was familiar, halfway between paste and a wet sweater. The shelf Calvin's team had moved leaned against the wall like someone caught dragging a body. Behind it, the metal door was open now. A rectangle of dark air pooled on the floor. "Security knows you're down here," Doris said, "but don't go far." 20 feet of concrete tunnel was enough to carry me 13 years. Pipes made high metal notes above me. The concrete was patchy with lime and old leaks. At the T-junction, I turned right and saw a utility door padlocked in an officious way, new hardware on old rot. Straight ahead, the passage ended at a wall that didn't match. Smoother port surface, no cracks, the color a shade off. When I rapped my knuckles, the wall responded like a sullen drum. I stood there too long, a tall child at a window no one else could see through. I wanted to punch it. I wanted to forgive it. I wanted someone official to swing a sledgehammer while I held my breath counting. But the library is a temple of permission, and I had none. I called the city police that afternoon and left a message for whoever handled cold cases, and then I called again because waiting is the thing that breaks you. Detective James Keller met me the next day in a gray jacket and a way of speaking that suggested he had seen grief before and knew how to meet it without touching it. "We're aware of the flood find," he said, walking the tunnel with me. "We can't just break into university property because we feel something in our bones, Ms. Kent. But the letters? If you locate those, that's probable cause." "How would I find them?" I asked. "People who hide things usually hide them the way they think," he said, glancing at the odd seam at the base of the shelf in the tiny room. "And this young woman thought in compartments." I took that as a permission he didn't officially give. That night, I bought a screwdriver set and borrowed a pry bar from Calvin, who looked like he wanted to ask what I planned to do and decided not to. I came back after the building closed. Doris had made sure security knew not to check the basement too aggressively, and I'm grateful even now for that quiet kindness. It didn't take much. The damp had loosened the wood. I slid the pry bar under the base of the shelf. The seam groaned and lifted a fraction. I wedged my fingers until splinters bit them and heaved. The base panel popped free, revealing a cavity just tall enough to hide a package the size of a shoebox. Inside, in 2 Ziploc bags taped together, were letters, 10 thick envelopes sealed with clear tape and labeled in Emily's sharp caps. I sat on the concrete and read them one by one with my flashlight against my knee. The Ziplocs had kept them almost dry. My throat closed at her precise hand. The first letters were clinical, like lab notes. She listed dates and times, the names on badges she had glimpsed through the cracked vent. D. Harper, S. Baxter, M. Quinn, and notations like cart at 12:40 a.m. and 3 boxes marked 4213C. She suspected they were moving equipment purchased with grant money that never reached labs. That sounded almost dull, which is the terrifying thing. Dull crimes can create desperate people. She wrote about her study partner, a man in his early 30s she met by the bulletin board when he saw her pinning a poster for a volunteer tutoring program. He'd told her he worked in maintenance and had shown her a stack of old keys and the trick to opening stubborn doors. He had sounded lonely. She had felt sorry for him. His first name in the letter was Daniel. Later, she just wrote D. The letters turned frightened. She wrote, "D told me I should stop looking. He said some of the rooms were unsafe. Tonight someone latched the outside door while I was down here. I got out through the vent into the stacks. It scraped my knees. I think they saw me." Another letter, dated the night before she vanished, said, "If I'm not back in the room by 2, I'm signing this and sealing it. Not because anyone will look, but because stories make better breadcrumbs than my memory will in the dark." At the bottom of that sheet, she'd written Laura and then scratched it out, then written Mom and scratched that out as well, as if she couldn't bear the order of our names. By the 8th letter, she stopped using names. He and they took over. The last page was barely half a page. She had begun to write, "I can hear them talking at the door," and then crossed it out and wrote, "I forgive myself for thinking I could fix a crooked system with a flashlight. I didn't realize I was making a sound until it startled me. An animal sound, thin and private. I put the letters back in the bags and for the first time in years called someone for help instead of trying to hold the weight alone. I called Detective Keller. He came fast. This time there was no lecture about warrants. He held the Ziplocs in his palm as carefully as if they were made of skin. "All right," he said to no one. "All right." He got on the radio. The university's council miraculously changed its tone when he used the words seal cavity and credible written evidence. By morning, there was a crew with respirators and a camera on a tripod and the kind of solemn quiet you hear in old churches. They broke through the poured wall into a short, narrow space. part closet and part dead-end hallway, as if someone had started to build a room and decided to end it a few feet shy of comfort. On one shelf, they found a collapsed cardboard box of logbooks, a stack of clipboards with blank forms, and a small blanket rolled and tied. On the floor near the far side was a scattered pile of gum wrappers, dozens of silver stars, damp but still bright. I pressed my fingers to my mouth. Emily had been there, making wishes with her hands. In a corner lay the thin strap of a backpack, the rest rotted into threads. A few feet from that, under a fallen slat of wood, lay bones. Later, the medical examiner would say it looked like she had fallen and been unable to leave. One ankle bone messily broken, ribs cracked. There were no marks to suggest she'd been beaten, no evidence of assault. She had likely been alive for hours, maybe longer, in a place meant to store secrets instead of people. The outer door, the one that led to the tunnel, had been sealed from the other side by poured concrete shortly after the university completed a miscellaneous maintenance project in early 2012, 6 weeks after she vanished. The records called it a structural reinforcement. The invoices were vague. One name appeared on a requisition line for temporary closure labor. D. Harper, Research Division. I had to lie down. Doris found a blanket, and someone guided me up the stairs. I remember the feel of the rail under my hand more than I remember the faces. When grief is a long practice, it meets new facts, like a body meets cold ocean water. A long breath in, a bracing ache, then a numbness that allows you to float. There was no suspect to arrest. Daniel Harper had died in a car accident in 2014 on a rain-slick road outside of town. The other names in Emily's letters belonged to people who had retired or moved. The lab equipment, long since replaced or misfiled into oblivion. Whatever petty theft or misallocation had been hidden there had evaporated like water on a basement floor, leaving only a chalk line. The university held a press conference. They said the word tragic 6 times. They said extraordinary circumstances. They said no evidence of foul play, as if foulness only lives in the marks a hand leaves on a body. I watched from the back, and when the reporters turned to go, I stayed until the microphones were unplugged, because leaving still felt like something I might do wrong. I could have gone home then. Many people told me I should. They said my presence made them ache in ways they hadn't planned for this spring. But I wasn't ready to return with just details. I needed to walk the exact path she had taken so that my footsteps could lay next to hers and argue with them. So I retraced. I visited the bulletin board by the basement elevator where she had met Daniel. The cork still held staples like tiny, shiny fossils. I went to the research division office and asked the receptionist to check old staff directories. The woman, sympathetic but brisk, looked up. Harper, Daniel, and found him listed as Facilities Liaison Research. I asked to speak to anyone who had worked with him. Only one name still matched on campus, Samuel Baxter, now a professor emeritus who came in twice a week to water his plants and check his campus mail. Professor Baxter wore the kind of sweater that made me want to stand straighter. He had a careful beard and a voice shaped by decades of telling students to slow down. When I told him who I was, he looked for a chair for me that was softer than the one he used. He remembered Daniel as a quiet man who wanted to be helpful. He remembered the 2012 project vaguely, a list of non-essential storage spaces to seal to reduce humidity problems. Daniel didn't design anything, he said. He ran errands between real maintenance and the labs and sometimes ordered pizza when we were stuck doing inventory. Then he looked directly at me in a way that suggested the long waves of this had reached his feet too. We were all busy. We signed papers. Being busy is a very good way to miss the thing that matters. What about after? I asked. Did anyone look back at those spaces? He shook his head and looked sincerely ashamed. I'm sorry. I should have thought to check. We all should have. I filed a public records request for the invoices and email chains from that winter. The clerk at the county office said it might take weeks. Then Doris made a call, and it took 3 days. I read the stack in the motel with a cup of bitter coffee. There was nothing overt, of course. Wrongdoing in institutions rarely writes itself in big letters. What I saw was a pattern. Small purchase orders split to stay under approval thresholds, equipment marked received that no lab acknowledged, A contractor paid cash for interior surface closure without an address. Someone had needed the tunnel space as a cache, a temporary place to hide boxes during audits where no one would think to look. Someone probably thought it would all be harmless and reversible. But when Emily discovered a vent and curiosity and conscience together, harmlessness ended. I drove to Daniel Harper's last listed address, a modest apartment complex with cracked asphalt, and found the manager. He remembered Daniel dimly, as polite and kept to himself. He allowed me to look at the application file. Next of kin listed as a sister in another state, Angela Harper. I wrote her a letter and sent it certified. A week later, she called. I had wondered, she said, after I told her my name and why I was calling. Her voice had a thickness to it, as if she had prepared for this conversation without knowing which direction grief would arrive from. About the car accident, he drank a little after that winter. He said he'd messed something up at work and couldn't stop thinking about it. He wouldn't tell me what. He said there had been a girl who never came home. She took a long breath. He kept a shoebox of things. There was a badge I couldn't return to anyone and some old keys. I threw them out after he died. I'm sorry. I told her she didn't need to apologize to me. We apologized to each other anyway, in the way strangers do when they are both holding a piece of the same broken plate and can't hand it to the other without cutting themselves. The medical examiner finished his report. The detective called me in to read the line that mattered most. Manner of death, undetermined. Meaning not homicide, not suicide, not accident in the clean legal sense, but something less tidy. It meant the law had no sentence that matched a girl wedged into a shortage of conscience. There are, in stories, moments where the protagonist gets vengeance, or at least the dignity of naming the villain. Real life offered something quieter, responsibility shared like a fog. I had to decide what counted as justice for Emily when the only people left to blame were processes and habit and our own tired compromises. So I stayed for the memorial. The university held it in the Commons. They pronounced her name carefully, as if being precise now might correct the imprecision then. People who had been freshmen the year she vanished came back as middle-aged parents and stood at the edges of the room, as if proximity itself might be a kind of apology. I spoke after the provost. I didn't have a speech. I had a story. I told him about her silver stars and about the way she said thank you to vending machines that returned her dollar. I told him she had been the first person to memorize the name of the woman who cleaned our dorm bathrooms and that she had once spent her last $10 on socks for a kid at the shelter who came in barefoot. Then I said something I had not planned to say. We tell ourselves that evil is dramatic. A man in a mask, a scream in the night. But sometimes evil is paperwork. Sometimes it's a vent cover no one checks because everyone is very busy. Sometimes it's a poured wall. We need a better enemy than busyness. We need to decide to be the kind of people who look back once more before we lock a door. The library renamed the basement reading room the Emily Granger Study Wing. The plaque carries a quote copied from one of her letters. Even in silence, stories wait to be found. I traced the letters with my finger the day they installed it. There were fresh coats of paint and new LED lights that hummed a brighter, less lonely hum. The warped shelf had been hauled away, though I kept a tiny splinter of it in my wallet without telling anyone. It sits behind my driver's license like a talisman, a memory of a door. When the university finished its internal review, they released a statement with the kinds of verbs that institutions use: regret, reevaluate, recommit. They created a new policy that nothing on campus can be sealed without a physical check and sign-off by at least 3 people from different departments. If you want to be cynical, you can say that's paper again. If you want to be me, you'll admit that paper can draw a different shape than the last time and call that a kind of hope. On my last evening in town, I slipped into the basement after the building had closed. I wasn't trespassing, not exactly. Doris had pressed a key into my palm with the warning to bring it back by B8 the next morning. I sat at our old table. The wood had been refinished, but the faint channel where a student carved MM+KC in 1989 still lingered. I put the notebooks in front of me, the ones that were legible. The police had allowed me to scan them. The originals would live in a box in the archives, accessible with permission, the way some stories require you to say please before they let you in. I read the last page again. If he asks about me, tell him I forgive him. At first I had thought she meant Daniel. The man who must have been tricked or pressured or tired enough to sign his name on a line that led to concrete being poured. But now I think she meant me too. She knew that I would spend years building a wall inside myself made of what-ifs. She was giving me a door. I took out a piece of lined paper and wrote my own letter to her, not to be found but to be emptied out of me. I wrote that I had put her silver stars in a new jar in the children's section of the library where I work. And when a kid asks what they are, I tell them we're saving wishes. And when we get to 1,000, we'll spend them on everything at once. I wrote that I would say her name aloud whenever I could. I wrote that the system that hid its small sins in a tunnel under fiction shelves would never get to hide her there again. I visited Doris the next morning to return the key. She hugged me in the doorway with all the gentleness of someone who has spent her life holding books that are older than she is and knows how fragile spines are. "You'll come back," she said, not to look for her, to sit. On the bus home, I watched fields wash by in green sheets and thought about the calm heroism of checking vents. I thought about how often we glance right past what our noses are trying to tell us. I vowed to be the sort of person who notices the cold draft, who asks why the wall sounds different when you knock on it, who listens when quiet girls say they heard voices on the other side. Months later, Detective Keller mailed me the last thing recovered from the little room after it had dried enough to handle, the cracked plastic lid of a thermos with a polar bear sticker. My sticker, actually. The one I'd given her freshman year when I messed up the print on mine and she said bears belong in pairs. I hold it sometimes before the library opens, a ritual like lighting a candle except it smells faintly of old tea. I'm not a crusader. I'm a person who stacks returned books on a cart and takes them out to the floor. Some mornings when I pull a book from a shelf and feel a stir of air, I smile and check the vent and tighten a loose screw, because those tiny acts are the opposite of sealing a door. People ask me if I'm angry, and I tell them yes in the way a river is. Not loud unless you get too close, not ending, moving around stones when it has to, carrying pieces of them along. I keep a picture of Emily in my kitchen. She is laughing at something I said, her head tilted back, mouth open, proof that laughter once lived where quiet lives now. When I make tea, I set another mug beside mine on the counter. It's silly. It helps. The university sent me 2 boxes last fall. Her recovered belongings, paper mostly, and a sweater that had somehow survived in a locker in the lost and found for a decade because someone thought it looked too nice to throw away. In the bottom of one box was a small wooden ring of the kind you use to hold a curtain. Taped to it was a sticky note in my handwriting, for Emily Stars. I had given it to her one night to keep the jar mouth from cracking. I sat on the floor and cried not only because she was gone, but because somewhere in that flood, through all that time, a wooden ring held its circle. Some things keep holding. A few weeks ago, a new student worker at my library asked why I moved so slowly down the stacks, fingertips grazing the spines instead of rushing the cart. I said, because books breathe. And she laughed. But it's true. Libraries breathe. They're alive as long as we are present in them. Ours has a maintenance checklist now that includes checking vent covers and never sealing anything without a literal head count. When I proposed it, my director said it felt overcautious. I said, that's what people call care when they haven't needed it yet. And she signed. Sometimes an older patron will linger at the desk to tell me their own story. A brother who didn't come home from a party. A classmate whose name still flashes like a low light in the back of their mind. I listen. I say their names back to them. We don't fix each other. We make more room around the ache. Maybe that's all memorials ever are. Extra room. When I close my library at night, I walk the aisles and whisper goodnight, to no one in particular and to Emily in specific. I touch the vent covers as ritual and promise. I straighten a book a student shelved upside down. I try to be the person who looks one more time. If you were to ask me now what happened to Emily, I could give you the facts. A flawed system hid a small crime in a hidden place. A good person found it. Men sealed a door because it was on a list. A storm later cracked what time had hardened. A friend came back and pulled at the seam. But the truth lives next to the facts and is not the same. The truth is that she was brave, that she wrote letters in the dark to make a path for someone else, that gum wrappers can become a constellation even underground, that forgiveness can be written without knowing who will need it. Her last undated note, if he asks about me, tell him I forgive him, no longer stings the way it did. Forgiveness is not a pardon. It's the only way for me to move through the years without turning to stone. When I think of Daniel Harper, I don't conjure a villain. I conjure a man carrying boxes at midnight who forgot to ask a second question and spent the rest of his short life unable to sleep. I conjure all the people who signed things and meant well and didn't look. I put my anger where it belongs, on the idea that busyness absolves us. On the anniversary this year, the university plans to place a small glass case in the study wing with her notebook open to a page where she had diagrammed the tunnel in tiny arrows. They asked me to write the caption. I typed. She was last seen in the library. She was found in the library. She never left what she loved. Then I added the line I read every morning before work. Look twice. Ask twice. Leave no one sealed away. I still keep a jar of stars. When we get to 1,000, I don't know what I'll wish for. Maybe for vent covers that sing out when they're bent. Maybe for shy girls to be believed the first time. Maybe for the right kinds of busyness, the kind that checks rather than seals. Maybe for the way the hum in a library can feel like a blessing rather than a machine. I used to be embarrassed at how long my grief lasted. Now I wear it like a long coat, one that keeps me warm and makes me slower in doorways, the better to hold the door for whoever is behind me. I talk to Emily sometimes in the spaces people leave between sentences. I tell her about a 7th grader who whispered she didn't think college was for people like her, and how I put a campus brochure in her backpack and wrote my number on it. I tell her about a grandma who cried at the desk because she thought she had lost her grandson, and how he came in smiling a minute later with milkshakes for both of them. I tell her I'm tired in a good way. I tell her that when it rains, I still catch myself counting the window streaks. I tell her I don't think about this sealed wall every day anymore. Some days I think about the wish jar instead. When I leave work on stormy evenings now, I stand under the awning and watch the world blur behind the rain. I like to imagine that somewhere, a person who almost forgot to look is turning back. I like to think that a door that was almost sealed is being left ajar. I like to think that the letters Emily wrote are not just evidence but instructions. What would you have done if you were the one who found those letters sealed behind the wall? Subscribe if you believe every truth eventually surfaces, and if you promise to look twice before any door closes.